Good evening, everyone. I'm Ann Kinseth. I'm the Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on this brisk evening here in Dallas. So we're very lucky to have two scholars with us tonight for our lecture, Dali and the Pursuit of Vermeer. We have both Esmée Quodbach and Danielle Johnson, who will each give short lectures. And following their presentations, my colleague Nancy Israel will be joining them for a discussion and an audience Q&A. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Esmée Quodbach. She is an independent art historian and art provenance researcher based in Princeton, New Jersey. She was educated at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and is a specialist in 17th century Dutch and Flemish painting, as well as the history of collecting. From 2007 to 2020, she was on staff at the Frick Collection in New York, last serving as the editor-in-chief and assistant director of the Frick Center for the History of Collecting. Previously, she held research positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and her research has been supported by, among others, the Mellon Foundation and the Getty Foundation. She's lectured and published widely on Dutch and Flemish painting and on the history of art collecting, and is the author and editor of many publications, including The Age of Rembrandt in New York, Dutch Paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Holland's Golden Age in America, Collecting the Art of Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Hals, America and the Art of Flanders, Collecting Paintings by Rubens, Van Dyck, and Their Circles, as well as the forthcoming collection of essays titled The Evolving House Museum, Art Collectors and Their Residencies, Then and Now. So please join me in welcoming Esmée Quodbach up to the podium.
Thank you, Anne, for your kind introduction and for the invitation to speak here this evening about Vermeer and about this wonderful painting, Woman in Blue Reading a Letter. I am not entirely sure, but I believe it may actually be the third painting by Vermeer to come to Texas and be part of an exhibition here. It's a lovely painting, and it's not only lovely, but also quite mysterious, as we will see. The Woman in Blue has been admired by many artists, and among them was the young John Singer Sargent, who saw this painting in Amsterdam in 1880, at a time when Vermeer was not very well known. In a letter to a friend, Sargent described Vermeer as, quote unquote, a tremendous man, and he urged his friend to go see several of Vermeer's paintings on her upcoming visit to Amsterdam. Among those was this work, which Sargent described as, quote unquote, a little woman in blue standing at a window, and which we can now see here at the Meadows, where it is on loan from Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. Vincent van Gogh, who was, like Vermeer, a Dutchman, was also a great admirer. Soon after Van Gogh saw the Woman in Blue at the Rijksmuseum in 1888, he wrote to his artist friend, Emile Bernard, quote unquote, do you know a painter called Vermeer who, for example, painted a very beautiful Dutch lady, pregnant? This strange painter's palette is blue, lemon yellow, pearl gray, black, white. Another artist who deeply admired Vermeer was, of course, Salvador Dalí, who once called him the greatest painter that ever was. Dali often drew the inspiration from Vermeer's art, and as you can see here, one of his sources was the Woman in Blue. And it is truly a treat to see the Woman in Blue here at the Meadows in the company of The Image Disappears, which was painted by Dali in 1938, and that is almost 300 years after Vermeer painted The Woman in Blue, which does not bear a date, but which is thought to date to circa 1663. Dali did not copy Vermeer's Woman in Blue, rather he borrowed, used, repurposed, and distorted some of its recognizable elements in order to create one of his so-called double images. In Dali's painting, we still recognize Vermeer's woman, but he has distorted her silhouette, which now also depicts a man's profile. The woman's head becomes the man's eye, her upper body becomes his nose, her arm and the letter she holds become his mustache, and her skirt becomes the man's beard. In short, Vermeer's woman fades and becomes something else, namely the profile of another old master painter whom Dali admired deeply, and that's Diego Velázquez. And on the right, you can see his self-portrait. This one was painted in 1640. And I should mention, of course, that one of Velázquez's great portraits of King Philip IV of Spain is now also on view here at the Meadows as a loan from the Frick collection in New York. But let's go back to Vermeer's Woman in Blue. What is it that we see here? We see a woman, maybe she is in her 20s, maybe in her 30s. We don't know who she is, and we don't get to know much about her or about her surroundings. She is standing in a room. We don't see a window, but we know there must be a window because the light is flooding in from the left and leaving shadows on the rear wall. The woman is dressed in a padded bed jacket of blue satin, which is decorated with bows on the front and the sleeve, and she wears a long, heavy skirt. One question that one can ask here, is this woman pregnant? Vincent van Gogh thought so. As I just mentioned, he described her to his friend as a very beautiful Dutch lady pregnant. Still, there is some debate about that among art historians. I believe she definitely has the look and the silhouette of a pregnant woman, but who knows? Unfortunately, Vermeer did not leave us any written notes about this painting or any other. Our woman is reading a letter. It appears to have arrived unexpectedly. She seems to have interrupted her morning toilet to read it. Her pearls lie on the table, where they are partially covered by another sheet of the letter. In fact, The Woman in Blue is not Vermeer's only painting of a woman reading a letter. Some 10 years earlier, in about 1653, he made this work, Girl Reading a Letter at an Open Window, which is also called The Letter Reader, and which now hangs in the Old Masters Picture Gallery in the city of Dresden in Germany. And I have to be honest with you, this work very likely also influenced Dali when he created The Image Disappears, as you can see here. But in Dali's time, Vermeer's Girl Reading a Letter looked very different. As you can see here, someone, not long after Vermeer's death, we don't know who and we don't know exactly when, decided that they did not like the big painting of the Cupid that Vermeer had originally painted on the rear wall of the interior, and then decided to paint over it, thus creating this bare grayish wall. So this is Vermeer's letter reader as Dali knew it, and everyone else for that matter, until very recently. In fact, it was only in 2021, last year, that the later overpaint was removed and that original Cupid was once again made visible. The whole process took conservators at the museum in Dresden about 4 years. Cupid is, of course, the god of love, and we see him in this painting within Vermeer's painting with his bow. Vermeer probably included Cupid here as an allusion to the letter that the woman has received, a love letter, presumably, and as an allusion to its sender, her lover, presumably. Some years later, when Vermeer painted The Woman in Blue, he did not include a painting with a Cupid, but a map on the rear wall. It is an existing map which represents the Dutch provinces of Holland and West Friesland, and it also appears in another work by Vermeer, The Officer and Laughing Girl at the Frick collection. And you see it's the same map, but it looks very different. Is there a reason that Vermeer included this map in The Woman in Blue? Does the map hint at a story that Vermeer wants to tell us here? Is the map perhaps a reference to the woman's husband or lover who is away and who is traveling, as some have suggested? Is the empty chair in the foreground perhaps also an allusion to an absent husband or lover? But we could also ask if Vermeer is actually trying to tell us a story here, or are the map and the empty chair just decorative elements in an otherwise sparse room? Again, Vermeer has not left any explanations. Another aspect of The Woman in Blue that I should mention to you is, of course, Vermeer's use of the color blue. The woman's luminous satin jacket is painted almost entirely with shades of ultramarine blue and white, while small quantities of black appear in the deepest shadows. For the many shades of blue in this painting, Vermeer used the highest grade of a pigment called natural ultramarine. And a pigment is the coloring substance of paint. Ultramarine is made of the powder of crushed lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone. And the best varieties of lapis were imported from present-day Afghanistan via Venice to the Netherlands, where Vermeer lived. And on the right, the upper image is a piece of lapis from present-day Afghanistan. In Vermeer's day, ultramarine was the most brilliant and the most expensive blue pigment available. The highest grade was more expensive than gold, and needless to say, the use of ultramarine made a painting very expensive. For centuries, blue was the color of heavenly gods. It stood for distance, for the divine, and for the spiritual. This interpretation goes back to ancient Egypt, and it was taken on by later cultures. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, for example, this very deep ultramarine blue was often used for the garments worn by the Virgin Mary. And here is a famous example, the Annunciation by the Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, which shows the Virgin Mary dressed in blue while she is interrupted at her reading by the announcement of the angel Gabriel that she would conceive a son by the power of the Holy Spirit, who takes the form of a white dove here. And you see the dove above her head, actually, a little to the left. And here is a slightly later and very different work, The Virgin Annunciate by a Sicilian painter named Antonella da Messina, also of the Virgin Mary, again dressed in blue, and again interrupted at her reading by the announcement. But we do not see the angel Gabriel or the Holy Spirit. From a psychological point of view, the color blue tends to have a calming effect, and it is said to lead to introspection. Vermeer employed ultramarine blue almost obsessively in his painting. It is even found in the light gray mixtures of the wall and the round ball of the map hanger. As I mentioned earlier, Our Woman in Blue is not dated, but it is thought that Vermeer painted her in about the year 1663, when he was about 31 years old. A little about Vermeer. Vermeer was born in 1632 in the Dutch city of Delft, where he is thought to have lived and worked his entire life. And you may well be familiar with this painting, the famous View of Delft, which he painted in about 1660, so just a few years prior to The Woman in Blue. Vermeer's father was a silk weaver in Delft, who also kept an inn and was also active as an art dealer. Many people held several jobs at the time to make ends meet. Later, Vermeer would take over his father's inn, and he would also become active as an art dealer. Vermeer's parents were Protestants, but when Vermeer was 20 years old in April 1653, he married a Catholic girl whose name was Catharina Bolnes. Such a mixed marriage was very unusual at the time, and documents in the Delft archives suggest that Catharina's well-to-do mother was initially not happy about the union. Vermeer converted to Catholicism for Catharina and seems to have become an active member of the Catholic community in Delft. Vermeer and Catharina would be married for 22 years until Vermeer's death at age 43, and they would go on to have 16 children, 5 of whom would die as infants. And please remember Catharina, because she will appear again in a little bit. During his lifetime, Vermeer was not very well known as a painter outside the city of Delft. And one major reason is probably that he had a local patron, a wealthy investor and art collector named Pieter Claes van Ruijven, who purchased at least 19 of Vermeer's paintings, among these also the view of Delft that you see here. Vermeer seems to have done well for some years. And I should add here that paintings by Vermeer are extremely scarce. Rembrandt, Frans Hals, and other Dutch artists of his day left hundreds of paintings. Vermeer, by contrast, left a very small body of work. It has been estimated that his entire original output probably consisted of some 50 to 60 paintings at the very most. One reason is that Vermeer is thought to have crafted his paintings carefully and slowly. Another reason is that he died young in 1675 at age 43. Many of those 50 to 60 works that Vermeer may have painted do not survive and are now considered lost. We know of several because they are described in old auction records. Today, leading Vermeer scholars believe that only 34 to 37 paintings by Vermeer's hand have survived. And the exact number depends on whom you ask. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam now accepts 37 paintings as genuine Vermeers. And I'm showing you a few of the most famous ones in this slide. On the left, the girl with a pearl earring in the Mauritshuis in The Hague, which is probably the most celebrated Vermeer right now. She's been called the Mona Lisa of the North. And some of you may have read Tracy Chevalier's novel, which was inspired by this painting. And some of you may have seen the movie starring Scarlett Johansson as the girl with the pearl earring, supposedly. In the center, you see the art of painting, now in Vienna, which was long thought to be a self-portrait of Vermeer. We know now that it is, in fact, an allegory. According to a document of Vermeer's time, it symbolizes the art of painting. And the artist who is depicted here, in fact, wears a theatrical costume. And on the right, you see the lace maker. The slide is a little deceptive because it's a tiny painting. It's this big. In 1869, it was bought by the Louvre in Paris, where it was seen by many visitors, among them many artists who copied it and made it famous. As I mentioned, Salvador Dalí was a great Vermeer enthusiast. He learned about Vermeer at a very young age when an uncle gave him this little book about Vermeer and his contemporary Pieter de Hoogh. Dalí would be inspired by several of Vermeer's paintings over the course of his long life, and sometimes obsessively so. We'll hear much more about Dalí and his fascination with Vermeer from Danielle Johnson in a little bit. But just to give you a taste, I'll show you a few examples here. Here is Vermeer's view of Delft. And the bigger painting here is Dalí's apparition of the town of Delft, circa 1936. And you see the town of Delft in the very distance on the left. Here is the lace maker and Dalí's early inspired painting. But his fascination with the lace maker lasted for several decades. Here is another example, and I believe Danielle is going to discuss this one as well. And this is a copy that Dali did of the lace maker for the New York banker Robert Lehman. It's the art of painting. And here is one of the many paintings that Dali did after this painting, The Ghost of Vermeer, which can serve as a table. And I think Danielle will talk about that as well. Just on a side note, as you may know, the Rijksmuseum is currently organizing what will be the biggest Vermeer exhibition ever. It will include no less than 28 of his circa 37 surviving paintings. The show will open in February, and the Rijksmuseum is the only venue. It is truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So if you happen to have a chance to go to Amsterdam sometime in the spring, do go and see that show. I'm sure you won't regret it. Many of the paintings that I'm showing you today, including the woman in blue and the view of Delft, as well as the girl with the pearl earring and the lace maker that you see here, will be included in the exhibition. I think the painting at the center, the art of painting, will not be included because it's fragile. The fact that Vermeer, during his lifetime, was mostly known locally in the town of Delft, and the fact that his paintings were so very scarce, made it easier for his name to be forgotten over the centuries. In our day and age, Vermeer is one of the most celebrated old master painters. Practically all, and I believe all but one of his paintings, are now owned by museums, where they are always among the most treasured works. But that was not always the case. When Vermeer died suddenly in the year 1675, at age 43, his widow, Catharina, was left behind not only with 11 children, ranging in age from 1 year to about 21, but she was also left with large debts, as is evident from court documents. Catharina testified that her late husband, during his final years, had sold, quote unquote, very little or hardly anything at all. The reason was that the market for paintings and other luxury goods had dried up after the French army invaded the Netherlands in the year 1672, the so-called disaster year. We are not sure about the cause of Vermeer's sudden death, but Catharina later also testified that her husband, due to the quote-unquote very great burden of their many children, and having no funds of his own, had lapsed into quote-unquote such decay and decadence, and had taken his personal troubles so to heart that he had quote-unquote fallen into a frenzy, and in a day and a half, he had gone from being healthy to being dead. What should we make of Catharina's sad testimony? According to one prominent scholar, the late John Michael Montius, a plausible interpretation of this statement is that Vermeer, panic-stricken over his inability to pay off his mounting debts and support his large family, suffered a heart attack or a stroke from which he died soon after. And just to give you a sense of the desperate situation Catharina and her many children found themselves in, not long after Vermeer's death, Catharina gave 2 of his paintings to a Delft baker named Hendrik van Buiten as collateral for a very substantial debt, namely more than 600 guilders, for bread the baker had delivered to their large family. And you see one of these 2 paintings that she gave to the baker here. For 600 guilders, one could, at the time, actually buy a small house or employ a skilled craftsman for a year. So the baker must have delivered a lot of bread to Vermeer's large family over a period of several years. It seems likely that Catharina did not pay off her debt. Baker van Buiten, who was actually one of Delft's most prominent and wealthy citizens, kept the 2 paintings that Catharina gave to him until his death 25 years later. But in addition to these 2 works, De Baker is known to have owned another work by Vermeer. Some years earlier, in 1663, a painting by Vermeer representing, quote-unquote, a single figure was documented in De Baker's house by a visitor from France. De Baker told the visitor he had paid a very high price. Actually, it was a sum that was so high that the visitor was shocked. Some scholars believe that this third painting that De Baker owned was Our Woman in Blue. And if it was, perhaps its very high and shocking price can be explained by Vermeer's extensive use of that very expensive blue pigment, ultramarine. Whatever the case, The Woman in Blue soon left Delft and passed through several collections elsewhere in the Netherlands and in France over the next century. Around the year 1800, Vermeer was more or less forgotten. By the early 1830s, The Woman in Blue could be found in England, where she had come into the hands of John Smith, a renowned art dealer who specialized in Dutch paintings. At this time, Smith was one of just a few connoisseurs who were familiar with Vermeer and his art. In 1833, he listed him as Van der Meer of Delft in a catalog, but he listed Vermeer merely among the quote-unquote scholars and imitators of another Dutch painter, Gabriel Metsu, who was then much more popular. The art market was in a slump, and the interest for Vermeer was at a low, and Smith noted that other art critics seemed entirely ignorant of this quote-unquote excellent artist. The Woman in Blue remained in Smith's possession for some 7 or 8 years. It was not until 1839 that he was finally able to sell the painting. Its buyer was a wealthy Amsterdam banker, Adrien van der Hoop, who bought several dozen paintings from Smith. For the Vermeer, van der Hoop paid a scant sum, £73. It was, in fact, one of his least expensive purchases from Smith. An important turning point in the history of the taste for Vermeer occurred a few years later, in about 1842, when the Frenchman Théophile Thoré, a connoisseur and art critic, paid a visit to the Mauritshuis in The Hague, where he had his first and unforgettable encounter with Vermeer's view of Delft. And here is what Thoré later wrote about that in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, a French art journal. In the museum at The Hague, a superb and most unusual landscape captures the attention of every visitor and makes a vivid impression on artists and sophisticated connoisseurs. Not knowing whom to attribute it to, I consulted the catalog, The View of the City of Delft by Jan van der Meer of Delft. Heavens, now there is someone we don't know in France and who deserves to be better known. After that first encounter with Vermeer, Thoré spent more than 2 decades traveling across Europe to locate all of Vermeer's works. He also met with Adrien van der Hoop in Amsterdam, where he saw The Woman in Blue, which he praised. It was mainly thanks to Thoré's great enthusiasm and his publications that the forgotten Vermeer became better known. Adrien van der Hoop, the banker, had no direct heirs, and he bequeathed his collection of paintings, including The Woman in Blue, to the city of Amsterdam. After van der Hoop's widow died in 1880, it was decided to move the collection to the then newly constructed Rijksmuseum. At the Rijksmuseum, The Woman in Blue was seen by many, and as such, it helped advance the growing appreciation of Vermeer in the late decades of the 19th century. Among the visitors who saw The Woman in Blue at the Rijksmuseum were many artists, and in closing, I would like to quickly show you just a few of the many works that were made by artists who were inspired by The Woman in Blue at the Rijksmuseum. Here we see a painting by Wilhelm, I think it's pronounced Hammarskjöld, of Denmark, who visited the Rijksmuseum in 1887. Vermeer became a major influence on Hammarskjöld's work. In 1899, he turned to The Woman in Blue for inspiration and he painted this work of his wife, Ida, reading a letter, and it's a mirror image of the woman in blue. Here is a more straightforward work by the German Klaus Meyer, who has changed a number of details. And here is the Dutchman Nicolaas van der Waay, who used Vermeer's woman as a model for this portrait of an Amsterdam orphan girl. Her uniform identifies her as an Amsterdam orphan. And here is the Frenchman Émile Trancy, again, a mirror image. And here is the American William Paxton, a member of the Boston School, who has turned Vermeer's 17th century Dutch woman into an early 20th century American housemaid. This last work is something entirely different. Woman Reading Music by the Dutchman Han van Meegeren, who borrowed the head of Vermeer's Woman in Blue along with her blue jacket with the bows down the front. Maybe the name van Meegeren rings a bell. He was a notorious Vermeer forger. His painting dates to circa 1935. It was never offered for sale, and it is believed that it was probably intended as an exercise for his other Vermeer forgeries. After he was arrested, it was found at his villa. If Dalí ever saw the woman in blue in person at the Rijksmuseum is uncertain. As far as I know, there is no evidence that he ever traveled to Amsterdam, although we do know that he visited Delft and The Hague and the museums there. Maybe Dalí saw a woman in blue elsewhere in an exhibition, or maybe he just knew it through a reproduction. Whatever the case, we are fortunate that we can see Vermeer's Woman in Blue and Dalí's The Image Disappears side by side now here at the Meadows. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Esmée. We look forward to hearing more from you at the end in our panel discussion. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker this evening, Danielle Johnson. Danielle Johnson is currently the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Eskenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University, where she oversees the exhibition program and a collection of over 45,000 works of art, ranging from the ancient Mediterranean to present day. Previously, she was curator of modern and contemporary art at the Vero Beach Museum of Art in Florida and a curatorial assistant in the Department of Paintings and Sculptures at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She's taught at New York University, the CUNY Graduate Center, Hunter College, and Florida Atlantic University. She earned her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, where her dissertation was on surrealist artists Salvador Dalí and René Magritte. And her BA is in art history and French literature from Colgate University. So please join me in welcoming Danielle to the podium.
It is a pleasure to be here today and to talk about one of my favorite subjects and always a popular one, Salvador Dalí. In 1954, Dalí received permission from the Louvre to make a copy of Vermeer's The Lace Maker. He was given a room to work at the museum, and conservators provided technical information on brushes, pigments, measurements, and canvas weave in order to facilitate the most exact replica possible. In the mode of an art historian, Dalí also read 17th century books on perspective, religion, and cartography in order to better understand Vermeer's thinking. Dalí completed his copy, which was commissioned by the New York banker Robert Lehman, first in New York and then in Port Lligat in northern Spain. In true obsessive fashion, Dalí wrote to Lehman that while working on the painting, he surrounded himself with 50 or so reproductions of the lace maker in Spain, even among the olive trees and on the beach. Dalí's painting is faithful to the original, with the exception of the large signature on the upper right, which is many times larger and more prominently placed than Dalí's usual signature. In this way, he seems to be laying claim to the image, at once paying homage to Vermeer while also distinguishing himself and proclaiming his own dexterity. While this particular copy, the first one I showed you, is his best known, Dalí created many more works, paintings, drawings, and even a few sculptures over the following years that were also inspired by this Dutch painting. And you can see three of them here. Dalí's copy of the Lace Maker is his most literal translation of Vermeer's work, and in many ways represents the culmination of his intense study and thinking about Vermeer over the previous 3 decades. Throughout his long career, Dalí emulated many of the technical qualities and formal characteristics of Vermeer and even other Dutch masters, including the small scale canvases, the minute attention to detail, unassuming subjects, and evocative compositions. Yet Dalí's interest in Vermeer went far beyond admiration for the artist's meticulous workmanship. In fact, Dalí's engagement with the Dutch artist's work contributed significantly to the development of his iconic surrealist style in the 1920s and 30s, and, moreover, to his understanding of surrealism as a movement that could accommodate both subjective emotion and objective fact. As the Meadows Museum's former director, Marc Roglan, indicated in his essay on Dalí and Vermeer in 2019, the decade between 1929 and 1939, the fertile years when Dalí was most closely aligned with the surrealist movement, also corresponded with the time that he painted the majority of works related to Vermeer. Dalí had studied the work of the Dutch masters through reproductions since he was a child. One of his earliest known paintings is Dutch Interior, very generic title, created in 1915 when he was only 11 years old. 10 years later, Dalí began writing about Vermeer in earnest, singling him out as the greatest of these old masters. Although he had not yet seen Vermeer's work in person, his uncle, a bookseller, had given him a book on Vermeer, and he likely had access to other publications as well. In a 1925 letter to the poet José Moreira Villa, Dalí wrote, quote, "Every day the Dutch amaze me more. Vermeer of Delft is the summum in painting, and he is the summum because with him the pictorial problem as a form of personal drama disappears." End quote. This is the first time Dalí indicates in writing his developing thoughts about Vermeer's practice, namely that Vermeer rejected grandiosity and expressive flair in favor of precision and clarity. In 1926, Dalí wrote to another poet, his friend Federico Garcia Lorca, proclaiming the greatest painter that ever was is Vermeer of Delft. He then describes a painting he calls Girl in Figueres, which is likely one of these on the screen. Of the two, Woman of Figueres has a closer relationship to Vermeer's The Lace Maker. And you saw this combination in this comparison in Esmée's presentation as well. Both of these paintings are very small, only about 7¾ and 8 inches tall. As I'm sure many of you have seen, part of the appeal of both Vermeer and Dalí's work has long been the diminutive size of their canvases and the incredible detail contained within these small surfaces. In style, though, the paintings exhibit a number of differences. Dalí's painting has a screwed perspective and simplified treatment of the shapes and surfaces that is more reminiscent of modern movements, not the old masters. The subject in this case is more noteworthy as a comparison, since both paintings show women working with needles, their heads angled downwards to look at their work. They concentrate closely on their needlework, exhibiting patience and a focus on craft and on the mundane that Dalí felt was essential to the practice of excellence in art. Girl Sewing, from slightly earlier in 1976, shows this same theme. A girl sits next to a large window with a coastal scene outside. Her simple domestic surroundings are reminiscent of a number of Vermeer paintings. Until recently, the whereabouts of girl sewing were unknown, and the image could only be seen through black and white reproductions. So it's informative to now be able to see the colors and nuances, particularly the blue and green of the girls' clothes and the crispness and luminosity of the white cloths. There are several preparatory drawings for this work, one of which you see here, in which Dali is carefully studying and planning the vanishing point and perspective. And just as an aside, the model for all of these works was a very convenient one, his younger sister, Anna Maria. In 1926, Dali traveled to Paris and Brussels, where he was able to see a number of works by Vermeer in person. And he published his first important literary piece titled Saint Sebastian, which refers to Vermeer in the section devoted to patience. He describes patience as, quote, a mode of passion, the humble patience in the maturing process of the paintings of Vermeer of Delft, which is the same mode of patience as that of the ripening of fruit trees, end quote. So I think that's a very evocative analogy when you think it through. And so to elaborate, one cannot rush the creation of art like Vermeer's or Dali's, just as one cannot rush the ripening of fruit, or you'll get something that's tough and unpalatable. And of course, in the face of waiting for this ripening process to occur, one is somewhat powerless and humbled. Dali chose to emulate this patience, although he initially saw patience and deliberateness as incompatible with the Surrealist movement, which by 1926, when he's creating these works, was beginning to dominate the Parisian art world. The Surrealist movement officially began in 1924 in Paris with the publication of the first Surrealist Manifesto. Dali's conversion to Surrealism occurred gradually over a period of years, from around 1926 through 1929. Although he was attracted to the movement, Dali was hesitant to embrace their tenets, and in his word, what he called the murky aspects of Surrealism. He ultimately diverged from the group in his allegiance to objectivity. The Surrealists' main tool at this time was automatism. And in fact, automatism, defined as a group of techniques used by Surrealists to facilitate the direct outpouring of unconscious thought, was almost synonymous with the movement in its first years. André Masson's Battle of Fishes is frequently used as an example of the autonomous process in the visual arts. To make this piece, Masson spontaneously applied gesso to areas of the canvas, the bare canvas, threw sand on it, brushed away the excess sand, and then the resulting contours of where the sand stuck to the canvas suggested forms that the artist then quickly drew and painted around in order to complete the image. Dali he toyed a little bit with automatist processes, but they never really appealed to him, which is not to say that Dali was uninterested in the possibility of delving into the unconscious. In fact, he would soon become very knowledgeable about psychoanalytic theory. However, Dali wanted to examine the interaction, or what he called the osmosis, between the internal and external worlds, in contrast to continuing to separate the two through the employment of automatism. For Dali, poetic emotion arises from pure objectivity, and he initially associated objectivity with the standardized projects of machine culture. In the 1920s, Dali thought that the rational expression of the unconscious could be achieved by using photography and film, particularly documentary photography and film, rather than by using traditional artistic forms like painting and sculpture. Photography and film, in his opinion, had the ability to stand at the juncture of reality and the unconscious and record the surreal in the outside world. Significantly, he invokes Vermeer throughout his abundant writing on photography and film. For example, in 1927, in Photography, Pure Creation of the Spirit, an article that he published in a Spanish journal, He declared his preference for the abilities of the canvas over what he called the turbid unconscious processes of the surrealists, evidently referring to automatism. He then devotes significant space to Vermeer, writing, quote, "In the history of looking, his eyes are the case of highest probity. With all the temptations of life, Vermeer, a new St. Anthony, preserved intact the object, with an inspiration altogether photographic, an outcome of his humble and impassioned tactile sense," end quote. Probity, which is not a word in vogue any longer, is the quality of having strong moral principles. So in this essay, Dalí likens Vermeer to a human camera, while proposing this ability was more than a technical skill. It was also an indicator of the highest character and sensibility, likely based in the practice of patience and humbleness that I discussed earlier. Dalí believed it was possible for painting to also stand at the juncture of reality and the unconscious, and upheld Vermeer as an exemplar of how to do so. He claimed that Vermeer was an artist who, quote, "makes use of the contours of the objective world, endowing it, however, with an appearance of absolute unreality, commonly taken as reality. Vermeer's reality, in contrast, is precisely that which escapes perception, poetic inspiration and lyricism," end quote. Dalí thought that Vermeer in particular replaced the subjective individual eye with the objective disinterested eye of the camera obscura, but still managed to create true, in Dalí, by true, Dalí means mysterious and poetic art. The idea that Vermeer used a camera obscura was proposed in the 19th century, not long after the artist had been rediscovered. A forerunner of the camera, this optical device creates an image by focusing rays of light onto a screen or sheet of paper, which then allows the artist to trace the perspective. In the beginning of 1929, Dalí and the Spanish filmmaker Luis Buñuel wrote the script for their film Un Chien Andalou, or An Andalusian Dog, which was filmed in Paris in April of that year. The most famous image occurs at the very beginning of the film, which is shown in the still on the left. Here, a woman sits quietly, about to get her eye sliced open, destroying her vision. They actually used a cow's eye in the movie, so those of you who have seen the film, and it is actually, to this day, it is very uncomfortable to watch that particular opening scene. Shortly after this scene, the film shows the same woman, thankfully with her eye fully intact, sitting alone in a bedroom reading a large book. A noise from outside disturbs her, and she throws the book down on a table, where it falls open to show a reproduction of Vermeer's The Lace Maker, which of course you see here on the right. The woman goes to the window and sees a young man lying on the curb. He has fallen off his bicycle. She then runs down and attempts to revive him. In many ways, the film is an exploration of Dalí's thoughts about the surrealist possibilities of cinema and film that he had been writing about for the past 3 years. First, there is a nonlinear and disruptive narrative. Second, the objects and events in the film are combined in a way that is illogical and surprising, leading the viewers to question both the contrast between these objects and also their possible affinities. And finally, the medium of film allows Dalí to test his idea that film can record the surreal and the objective world and be an effective tool for surrealism by facilitating this osmosis of reality and the unconscious. He saw that exact combination in Vermeer's work as well, hence the inclusion of the lace maker at the very beginning of the film, setting this idea forth before you even get into the last 20 minutes or so of Un Chien Andalou. The film was an immediate success, casting Dalí, who had been a complete newcomer to Paris and the Surrealist movement, into the limelight. Soon after joining the Surrealist movement and making his big splash with Un Chien Andalou, Dali began to develop the paranoid critical method, which is considered to be his unique contribution to Surrealism. With this method, Dali was attempting to represent how a paranoid individual structured or understood reality, and in this way, bringing the mind's workings into the real world. He was interested in the paranoid ability to create irrational links between objects, links that are cohesive and coherent to the paranoid person, but not immediately apparent to others. A single form can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on individual obsessions or desires. This is what I really wanted to show you. With this method, Dali was attempting to represent, for example, when viewing a postcard of Africans in front of a hut, he mistook it in its vertical orientation for a painting from Picasso's African period, with which he was currently preoccupied. Dali then showed the postcard to Surrealist leader André Breton, who saw a portrait of the Marquis de Sade in this image. Dali later illustrated these delusions by publishing 3 images in the Surrealism in Service of the Revolution, which was a French journal, and you see that publication here on the screen. One was the original postcard in its horizontal orientation. Another was in its vertical orientation in order to show this image of the hut and figures, and the last was altered to appear like a face. It's important to emphasize that Dali viewed these paranoid deliriums not as symptoms of badness or simple errors of the mind, but rather as a form of interpretation. As a perceptual phenomenon, paranoia allowed a person to register reality differently, with the implication that reality is subjective. In 1929 or 1930, simulating the paranoid delusion himself, Dali began creating paintings with one form in which 2 or more images can be distinguished. In his first of these, which you see on the right, titled Paranoid Woman Horse, Invisible Sleeping Woman Horse Lion, the central form can be seen as a woman, horse, or lion. The woman is reclining with her arms and head to the left. The horse's head is perceived in the same form as her arms, and the mane of the lion is to the right. In theory, when contemplating any object in the world, the number of associations, and therefore the number of multiple images, is limited only by the paranoid capacity of the individual. Dali's working process for the multiple images was by necessity extremely deliberate and even labored. This painting, as the first of his many paranoid images, has a particularly awkward appearance, in my opinion, and the multiple images are less clear than the one we will look at next. But first, we will go back to these art historical precedents. Only a few scholars have explored the art historical influences on Dali's method. Arcimboldo, the 16th century painter who arranged fruits, vegetables, flowers, and books in such a way that they formed a portrait, has been discussed as a possible visual forebear of Dali's multiple image paintings. Anamorphosis, such as the skull scene in Hans Holbein the Younger's The Ambassadors, is also a possible source. Vermeer, as Dali's foremost hero and the historical artist he saw as most successfully revealing the poetry of the everyday, also needs to be considered as part of a full understanding of the paranoid critical method. And in fact, given Dali's astounding focus on Vermeer throughout the years, it is not surprising that he used Vermeer's work to show the form of interpretation that results from paranoid or obsessive perception. So here we come to the wonderful paintings that the Meadows has on view currently. Vermeer's Woman in Blue Reading a Letter from around 1663, and Dali's The Image Disappears from 1938, which, as Esmée mentions, almost 300 years later. Vermeer's painting shows a woman standing in profile in front of a window, head bent, quietly reading a letter from an unknown writer. A number of Vermeers, as you saw earlier, follow this iconic compositional formula of a figure standing next to a window. And you saw this earlier as well, though Esmee's image was a little bit better than mine, I realize. But this also, of course, would have served as a general reference for Dalí. And, you know, what I find interesting about this comparison in particular is that he seems to have borrowed two compositional elements in particular: the curtain, you know, to frame and reveal the space as if the viewer is looking out onto a stage, and also the cloth at the bottom left, the cloth on the table that is bunched up. Dalí's The Image Disappears is not a copy of a work by Vermeer, but rather a vehicle for Dalí's paranoid critical method and the visceral manifestation of Dalí's obsessive perception. The relatively simple forms of Vermeer's Woman in Blue reading a letter lend themselves effectively to Dalí's double imagery. And The Image Disappears is a particularly clear and elegant example of his paranoid critical method. In The Image Disappears, one can still see Vermeer's woman reading a letter, but Dalí distorts the figure of the woman in such a way as to simultaneously depict the profile of a man. And I won't belabor that description, as Esmée went through it very clearly, but I just want to point out what I find really wonderful about this painting in person, which I was just able to see it earlier today, is the luminous quality of the cheek. That, of course, doubles as the light that is coming in from the window. It really has this a beautiful glowing quality of light, but then, you know, the effective use of that as the flash of the profile of the portrait. The muted earth tones of Dalí's painting make it much easier, for me at least, to see both images. In other paranoid critical paintings, the bright colors can actually, I think, make it more difficult to discern the forms. And that's what I like in particular about this particular Dalí painting, that you're able to immediately recognize the double imagery. Both paintings include a map on the wall. Maps can be found in a number of Vermeer's paintings. Even the early 19th century writers on his work noted their prevalence. And the specific maps themselves have been identified since the 1970s. In Woman in Blue reading a letter, the large map on the back, which hangs behind that hangs on the wall, has been identified as a map of Holland and Friesland, printed sometime in the 1620s. Dalí's map is proportionally a lot smaller, likely because he didn't want to interfere with the viewer's reading of the multiple image. He has replaced the map of the Netherlandish provinces with a map of Spain. The west coast is clearly visible up to the border of France and down to the very top of North Africa. Dalí was from the Costa Brava, north, which was the north part of the west coast, and was a proud and dedicated Spaniard throughout his life. Again, with this painting, he is both paying homage to Vermeer while also referencing his own background and laying claim to the uniqueness of his own creation. To create The Image Disappears, Dalí made a number of studies, two of which you see here. In the one on the left, there are actually two figural images. So the leftmost image is a partial nude, where Dalí is focusing on the pose and anatomy of the female figure. And the image on the right, he begins to integrate the male portrait head. The general outline of the hair and the head and the hair can be seen. The eye is beginning to emerge, and the nose has become, I think, in this image, particularly clear from her shoulder and breast. In the second pencil study on the right side, Dalí has given the portrait head more equal treatment and detail, with the result that it is easier to see. None of these, you notice, include the map, as Dalí is concerned in these studies with the problem of creating the double image. And in fact, the one on the right is on view at the Art Institute of Chicago. The The portrait head is not just a generic person. Instead, it is a portrait of another artist Dalí had greatly admired since childhood, Diego Velázquez, we both managed to find the perfect portrait for this comparison, which is the one on the left. Dalí referenced Velázquez multiple times in his mature painting, especially from the 1950s onwards, although not nearly at the frequency and intensity that he referenced Vermeer. Velázquez recreated numerous self-portraits, which Dalí would have seen in person and in reproduction. So the two here, he is approximately 45 to 50 years old in these works. And I think he's looking quite confident and debonair, particularly on the one on the right. And Dalí, as someone who was quite concerned with his public image, would most likely have been attracted to images like this. In comparing the image disappears and the self-portrait, you can see, particularly based on the dark hair and mustache, how Dalí was giving the impression of Velázquez. I could not resist showing Velázquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas, which fascinated Dalí. This painting also has a self-portrait of Velázquez standing in front of the canvas and looking out at the viewer, and as well as the portraits of the King and Queen of Spain and their in the mirror in the back, and their daughter, the Infanta, who is being attended by her handmaidens. As official painter to the king for decades, Velázquez was the foremost Spanish artist of his age. On his chest, you see the red cross, which is the cross of the Order of Santiago. So this proclaims his knighthood. Many scholars have interpreted this painting as, at least in part, Velázquez's positioning of himself as a foremost craftsperson, but also as an intellectual. And this is the notion that Dalí himself pursued, that he was both a very accomplished, technically accomplished painter, but also an intellectual. Considering these questions, I also want to suggest for a moment that Dalí may have had another figure in mind when creating this double portrait, himself. You see here a photograph of Dalí from the 1940s with his thin mustache. In this image in particular, his nose is quite prominent, his dark hair, and of course, his very proud, one might even say arrogant demeanor. So it is certainly possible that in this one image, this one painting, he is evoking three different painters, Vermeer, Velázquez, and himself, which creates a type of lineage of inspiration and allows Dalí to place himself in the company of the greats, which he definitely thought that he belonged there. So here we have this lineage that I am suggesting. Now I'd like to return to the lace maker, particularly Dalí's paranoid version of the lace maker, dated 1954 to 55. Here, the lace maker's face is surrounded by conical forms that resemble rhinoceros horns. In 1950, a friend had given Dalí a walking stick with the handle made out of a rhino horn. Not something that a friend would give you today, I think. The artist began to see horns in his paintings and those of other artists, including Vermeer. We know through various texts and lectures that Dalí considered the horn to be a perfect logarithmic spiral, or a perfect form that is present in nature. Dalí posited that through the resemblance he recognized between the Vermeer painting and the curved horns of a rhinoceros, he had revealed the underlying scientific structure of Vermeer's The Lace Maker. According to this theory of his, these curvilinear forms could be compared to the mathematically self-perpetuating logarithmic spiral, an idea that Dalí also explored in a film that he worked on entitled The Prodigious Story of the Lace Maker and the Rhinoceros. So here we have a larger image of this paranoid version of the lace maker. And you see the rhinoceros horns and also the sense that these are, exploding outward in a very frantic fashion. In fact, is quite counter to the image itself. Logarithmic or growth spirals often appear, as I mentioned, in nature. And in order to verify these quasi-scientific discoveries, Dalí organized a mock battle staged in the rhinoceros habitat at the Vincennes Zoo in 1955. And you see here he is confronting the rhinoceros with numerous copies actually of the lace maker. And to Dalí's, happiness, the animal used its horn eventually to tear to pieces one of these oversized copies, which for Dalí affirmed that this affinity between the rhino and Vermeer's The Lace Maker that, he had obsessed upon was in fact correct. So according to the logic of Dalí's paranoid critical method, because of his obsession with the lace maker, he was able to uncover the hidden image and meaning of the painting. I'd like to end by examining the image of the painter, a few paintings that focus on the image of the painter, particularly in the act of painting. As we've already seen, Dalí considered Vermeer to be an exemplar, and he measured himself against him. Vermeer's The Art of Painting is an allegory of the art of painting. The artist sits with his back to the viewer, concentrating on the model. With a laurel on her head and holding a book by a Greek historian, she is believed to be posing as Clio, the muse of history, who inspires the painter and also proclaims the history of painting and its glory in the Netherlands. In 1934, Dalí created a series of paintings that draw upon this work and depict the artist from the art of painting viewed from the back. This particular one, which is the Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can be used as a table, shows an attenuated, distorted figure of Vermeer kneeling on the ground and staring into the distance. His right leg is extended to form a table with a bottle and a glass resting upon it. The setting is a narrow alley in Port Yagat, which leads to the local cemetery. This is a detail that gives the image a more spectral context, evoking those who came before us and reminding us of our own mortality. The painter, however, has the chance to achieve lasting cultural significance, a type of immortality in what they leave behind. In enigmatic elements in the landscape, which is this piece here, Dalí connects the costumed figure of the artist to himself. As you barely see in this detail, there is a small boy dressed in a sailor's outfit in the distance. Next to the boy is a seated woman who is a nanny figure. These two figures show up often in Dalí's work, and the boy is Dalí himself, which is taken from photographs of him as a child. Again, Dalí connects himself to Vermeer, indicating their affinities while also associating himself with the great art and artists of the past more generally. This final painting I'll show today is Dalí's seen from the back, painting Gala from the back, eternalized by 6 virtual corneas, provisionally reflected by 6 real mirrors. So this is a very late work, dating from 1972 to 1973. And is an example of his experiments at the time with stereoscopy, the science concerning pairs of 2-dimensional images that appear to exist in 3 dimensions through binocular viewing. The reflection in the mirror in both of these recalls the mirror in Velázquez's Las Meninas. But again, the clearest art historical reference is to Vermeer's The Art of Painting, with the image of the painter seated and seen from the back. The connection to stereoscopy, too, is related to Vermeer and the idea that Dalí had held about the artist since the 1920s, specifically that Vermeer was the foremost artist who was able to evoke poetic emotion by aiming for pure objectivity, which Dalí had long ago associated with machine culture. To conclude, Dalí's interest in Vermeer ranged over his entire career and was vast, sustained, creative, and also quite complicated. What is most significant and wonderful to me as a scholar of surrealism is that a Dutch old master artist was formative in the development of Dalí's most innovative ideas, which in turn changed the surrealist movement itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd love to invite our speakers to join the panel. And I'd love to introduce Nancy Cohen-Israel, who is here to moderate. Nancy is an art historian, art educator, writer, and curator. And she is my colleague here at the Meadows Museum, where she is the manager of docent programs. Additionally, she's a regular contributor to Patron Magazine, where she writes primarily about the visual arts. So we'll spend our last 15 minutes of the program with a brief moderated panel, followed by opportunity for all of you to ask our scholars today questions. So Nancy, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you, all of you. Thank you for sticking around for these last 15 minutes or so. First of all, I just didn't realize that Dali was riffing on Velázquez for his mustache. I just thought that was his own little unique quirk. But one of the things that really struck me in looking at all of these works and listening to both of you is how rooted in place both of these artists are. So in the case of Vermeer, his use of ultramarine in Delft, which, you know, in the 17th century had over 30 factories dedicated to Delft porcelain. And of course, the major color was blue. And you see blue so primarily in his work. And of course, in the case of Dalí, his tie not only to Spain, but specifically to being Catalan. And I'm wondering if you could each talk a little bit about that.
Is it on?
Yes.
Vermeer and Delft. I think Delft was still a very small town at that time. And I think it was a town that, I mean, the Netherlands at that time, it was the golden age. So until that very terrible disaster year, life was pretty good in Delft. And Vermeer, as far as we know, spent his whole life there, was very involved with his own Protestant community and later the Catholic community. I think in the small town, he would have known pretty much everyone. We don't know if he ever left. We don't know with whom he studied. So I think he used the local resources. And I think that's how Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who was who worked on the microscope and who was sort of an early scientist, was a friend from his early years onwards. He was really sort of someone who belonged in the town, and I think you can see that. I mean, his view of Delft, I think, is a wonderful painting and shows that he was very proud of Delft also.
So Dalí was very attached to Spain throughout his life, despite the fact that he spent quite a lot of years in Paris and then also in New York. And in fact, when you live in New York, you'll still meet people who met Dalí and in the hotel where he lived at the time. But he identified with Spain and particularly with Catalonia. And that's the context in which he developed his initial ideas. And that's where he received information about the Surrealist movement through a number of very important avant-garde journals. When he wrote for those journals, it was in Catalan. Very rarely did he publish in Spanish language journals. And there was also they developed an idea that was actually called anti-art. And it's something that's known to be very unique to Barcelona and Catalonia at that time, and very much counter to what they perceived as the much more bourgeois culture of the rest of Spain. So that's the context in which Dalí developed, and he remained very dedicated to that area and its uniqueness throughout his life.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'd like to open it up. I do have other questions for you all, but we'd like to hear if anyone has questions. Anne will come around with a microphone. We are recording, so we'd love to capture if anyone has any questions for our speakers.
Thank you. And thank you for fabulous overviews. I enjoyed this very, very much. Before the talks began, I was able to see some of the Dali prints that are hanging in the museum at the moment. And I was struck also by your introduction, of course, to the period of Vermeer, in which prints are such an important part of the art market. And Vermeer, as a seller of art, is he taking advantage of that new art form that publicizes art at all? Or is he instead keeping to the more traditional forms of simply the painted individual image and not to the reproduction of image? And what does that say about his approach to art? And of course, Dali, the great admirer of Vermeer, is not doing that at all. He's creating massive numbers of prints, so many that, for a while in New York, I remember you saw so many, it wasn't entirely clear what was really Dali and what was.
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Sure.
the forged market was very rich at the time.
Speaking about Vermeer, what I find interesting is that apparently he only painted. No drawings are known, no prints are known. So his focus really was on paintings. And as an art dealer, would he have seen prints? Absolutely. Would he have seen drawings? Absolutely. And if he did, they haven't survived or they are not known to us. So it's guesswork. We don't know. We can only sort of try to reconstruct how that would have been for him. And you're absolutely right. There was a massive print industry. So, but he doesn't seem to have been part of that.
If I heard correctly, it was mentioned the Spanishness of Dali. Is that true? Yeah. It's interesting that you said that, because when you look at the Vermeer and the Dali, and the fact that he turned his piece into a Spanish piece, no question. The map that he hung on the wall was of Spain, precisely Costa Brava, and that part of his Spain, and also Diego Velázquez. So he was just demonstrating that to the max. To me, when you look at those two pieces in comparison, he brought, what used to be Spanish territory when Vermeer was alive, and almost imprinted Spain back into Holland, if you will, in his mind. Is that probably fantasy on my part? I don't know.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. So I mean, I love the fact that he kind of Spanishifies Vermeer's work, and I think it's not just an easy thing. That it in fact has to do a lot with how he saw himself, and how he saw, again, his work developing, and where he saw himself within the history of art. As much as he admired Vermeer, I think he saw himself much more connected to the art history of Spain and to the lineage of that he inherited within Spain, with Velázquez in particular, but others as well, and even his connections with modern artists. He was particularly fascinated with Picasso, of course, as many were, but even more so than other surrealists. And he was very close with Miro, and Miro, in fact, helped him early on in his career. So I think he really thought in those terms of inserting himself into that context long term.
Can you tell me, was Dali influenced at all by Goya?
I was actually thinking about that the other day, and I don't think that was a big influence on Dali. Of course, he would have been aware of Goya's work, but I think in our minds, the Goyas that come to our minds in particular would have been a little too dramatic for Dali in some ways. That's not all of Goya's work, of course, but those, I think a lot of what it would have been, he would have seen it as a bit too dramatic, and not this, the patience and the deliberateness that he was attracted to in Vermeer.
Vermeer has been in the news a great deal lately with the painting at the National Gallery that's been downgraded and is now decided it is not a Vermeer. Also, they've been talking about Vermeer's care with which Vermeer painted paintings they discovered or feel that through the examinations of recent Vermeer paintings that he actually was much more liberal in his approach and was not as careful as was originally thought, that underpainting is much broader and more direct. And also earlier, the question of optical devices being used by Vermeer to achieve the quality that he was able to achieve, which actually from the thought process would be that if he did not do drawings and was not a draftsman in that sense, and also which is a normal way to learn how to structure things and think about painting. How did he do that few paintings and be that good if he wasn't using optical devices? And I was just wondering, on those three questions, do you have an opinion, since we have an expert here?
Vermeer attributions, yes. I told Danielle it's a minefield, and I'm so glad that I won't have to talk about that this evening. So it really is a minefield. And as you say, the National Gallery painting Girl with a Flute has been in the news because it was said to be, it still is said to be by the National Gallery of Art to be by someone in the circle of Vermeer. No one knows what the circle of Vermeer means. Even the people who have come up with that don't know this. National Gallery has a few months ago said what they had said years ago. It is not by Vermeer. A few weeks ago, the Rijksmuseum has announced the painting will be coming to the big exhibition in Amsterdam. The National Gallery is sending it as not by Vermeer, but it is being exhibited as by Vermeer. What to make of that, I don't know. I think there's different schools of thought on what Vermeer is, on who Vermeer was, and what his art is. So I find it very interesting to read the opinions, and some I agree with and some I don't. And I don't think the last word has been said about this yet. Also on the use of the camera obscura, and you probably know there's very different opinions about that as well. And aspects of all these ideas make sense. So ultimately, well, I guess everyone has to decide for themselves. This is what I think is more right than the other opinion. So it's still there's still so much going on, and there's so much research also on, did Vermeer paint slowly, did he paint carefully, or as the Rijksmuseum now says, well, he was actually not very quick, but he was quicker than we thought. I'm curious to read about that, actually. I just would like to see what we have to say. I know that they have an excellent conservation department. I know the National Gallery of Art has a really excellent conservation department. So we'll see what people have to say. And well, let's just keep it at that. It's a minefield.
Actually, I've got another question for you, Esmée, along those same lines. in the history of painting, the artists seated at the back, we've always, many of us, myself included, were raised to that this was a self-portrait, and the same in the Procurus that he had done years earlier. It's in the same costume as self-portrait. Based on what? I mean, how he left no writing. So on what basis do we feel these are self-portraits?
I think maybe we often want to see a self-portrait. And well, in Vermeer's case, the art of painting, we see this man from the back. So what is that even? But I think there is a desire. We want to see a face. Because I was going to say something, but unfortunately I cannot show you the self-portrait. And actually he did. We know a self-portrait of Vermeer is mentioned in an old auction record. So that has not survived, or we don't know about it yet. So I think we want to see self-portraits. We want to see family members. Is this pregnant woman, is that Vermeer's wife? Who knows? I mean, Vermeer hasn't told us anything about. Would it make sense? Yes, all of these painters use their own family members because it was cheaper, for one thing. But I think we want to know more about them, and we want to recognize people. I think that's what it is.
And then just final parting thoughts, the light in both of these artists' work is so magnificent. And Danielle, you touched upon that in your remarks. Again, one of the things I find fascinating, and if you all have not seen the two paintings upstairs, we're open till 9, go check them out, is that you've got the Spanish painter. We think of Spain as being this sunny place, and yet that one just sucks all the light out of the room. And we think of the Netherlands being dreary and rainy, and yet that's just luminous. So I don't know if you all have parting words about the light in both of these works.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that comparison. I would say that this is, in terms of color and light, this is a pretty unusual painting for Dalí. And I think in this instance, as I touched on, he was really trying to strip the image down to these really essential elements. And that's why I think it is a particularly effective example of his double imagery, that there aren't a lot of distractions. The light sources in Dalí's work are usually not that glowing nor that subtle. So that's also a bit unusual for his work. And the colors are certainly saturated, and he focuses a lot on the blue skies. But this use of light, I think, is very much reflective of his study of Vermeer's work.
Yeah, I think Vermeer really, it is that northern Dutch light that I think he's been able to catch exactly as it is often. And maybe, again, the use of lapis lazuli has something to do with that also, because it's so bright and it's so intense. And I think the painting that is here now, Woman in Blue, reading a letter, I think the blue is just extraordinary, and it has been cleaned recently, so that also helps. Because if you look at old reproductions, it's very brown, it's yellowish, and but now, I mean, a lot of these paintings are being cleaned, and the blues are just fantastic.
Yeah, luminous, which is extraordinary. Well, wonderful. Well, if you all are interested in asking more questions, feel free to come up after. Also, if you're interested in knowing more about Salvador Dalí, next Thursday night we are screening Salvador Dalí in Search of Immortality, and we hope you will join us then. But thank you both for being here.